Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Many left activists in the 1960s felt their work was guided by the sense that they may be the last generation in the experiment with living. Their fears are readily seen today in some of the dramatic calls to action by young populist activists and students on many American university campuses. Many of the same concerns, interconnections, and insights of progressive activists in the 60s still exist and have been manifested in new wars, a profound increase in environmental abuse, racism, genocide, and a general militaristic fear-based worldview today that continues to bedevil the human condition. It's also clearly seen in the general consensus by scientists around the world that the Earth's ecological balance in the next 20 to 50 years will not exist as we know it if present political and environmental policies are not radically changed. Great segments of humankind, numbering perhaps in the tens or hundreds of millions of people, will simply not survive. If the theory of evolution has taught us anything, it's that most species become extinct. There's no guarantee that this will not be as true of the human species as it has been of the overwhelming majority of other ones. Many young activists who matured in the post-World War II era felt their efforts then were in a proud, ongoing, living American tradition of social dialogue and change. Many young activists today agree. What was needed to be done then still needs to be done today. If this world doesn't have a place for us, then another world must be made. What's missing is yet to come. Our guest today understands this dynamic perfectly. He's rekindling the 60s generation, enormous positive change energy into a new movement called the Third Act, where those over 60 years old will be able to use their expertise, idealism, numbers, and considerable political and economic clout to back up the great work of younger people on some of the unfinished business that the older activists themselves struggled with in their earlier years. Bill McKibben is America's foremost environmental activist. He's founder of the first global grassroots climate campaign, 350.org, serves as the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. His most recent book is The Flag, The Cross, and the Station Wagon. As Bill puts it, it's about a graying American looking back at his suburban boyhood and wondering what the hell happened. We're all wondering what the hell happened and what we can do about it. And we're thrilled to have Bill here for the first of what we hope will be many visits on the Radical Imagination. Thank you. Hi, Bill.
Hello there. What a pleasure to join you.
It's an enormous pleasure. And we'll get to your book in a few minutes, but I thought for our audience and for myself, can we start with some information, some of the data, the most relevant data you use from your own climate science sources, quantitative, qualitative? What should people be paying? What attention should they be paying to? What data, I should say, should they be paying the closest attention to? Because there's a lot of information out there, misinformation. We hear all kinds of stuff. And so I think it'll be helpful if we start out with that sort of question.
Well, climate science is not all that hard. I mean, I wrote the first book about this back in 1989, and we basically knew everything then that we needed to know. When you burn coal and gas and oil, you put carbon into the atmosphere. The molecular structure of CO2 traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. Basically, we're heating up the planet and doing it very, very quickly. we knew all that back in the 1980s, as I say. We didn't know exactly how fast or how hard it would pinch, and it's pinched harder and faster even than we suspected. So far, human beings have raised the temperature of the Earth 1 degree Celsius. So that's about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like that much. So let's express it in different units. Every day, the extra heat that we trap near the planet because of the carbon we've put in its atmosphere is the heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized explosions. And when you know that, it's easier to understand how we've melted half the sea ice in the summer Arctic, how we've begun to raise dramatically the level of the oceans, how we've changed the planet's hydrological cycle, such that, well, if you wanted one fact to kind of keep track of the 21st century, it would be warm air holds more water vapor than cold. As a result, we see much deeper drought in arid areas, and with that, big fires. But once that water is evaporated up into the air, it's going to come down, and in wet areas, it comes down in deluge and downpour like we've never measured before. So we're creating a world of extremes, and that's with 1 degree increase in temperature. We're on a path right now for a 3-degree increase in temperature. If we let that happen, 3 degrees Celsius, 5-6 degrees Fahrenheit, then we will not have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. So all the work that everybody's doing is merely an effort to try and keep that number to 2 degrees or maybe a little bit lower. That won't be good. If 1 degree melts the Arctic, we're fools to find out what 2 will do, but we're going to find out, or close to it, even if we do things right now. But that's what the push is about, trying to limit climate change to the point where it doesn't cut civilization off at the knees. It's not clear that we're still capable of doing that, but the best science indicates that if we move right now, we've got a reasonable shot.
A reasonable shot. Okay, so we're not at doomsday quite yet. Okay, all right. So we do have the capacity, the ability, the technology. And do we have the moral and spiritual will and political will? And what is it going to take? And how has that been incorporated in your newest effort here, the third act, which I'm particularly interested in?
So the good news is that we have the technology that we need. Over the last decade, the engineers have really done their job, Jim. And the price of power from the sun and the wind has come down roughly 90%. The cheapest way to generate power on this planet now is to point a sheet of glass at the sun, which is a real miracle. And it gives us the possibility of moving quickly if we want to. Now, given the existential nature of the crisis and the fact that we have a solution at hand, you'd be excused for asking why we're not going at it with everything we have. And the answer to that, of course, is that there are forces that don't want us to, mostly the fossil fuel industry, who would like to extend their business model, digging stuff up and setting it on fire, for another couple of decades. That means that if we're going to move at the speed that physics demands, that we'll need to match the efforts of the engineers with the efforts of activists and citizens who try to break the power of the fossil fuel industry and produce the political and moral will, as you put it, to move forward. That's what I've been working on for many years. We set up a thing called 350.org in 2008, which was the first iteration of a big global climate movement. We've held, we think, about 20,000 demonstrations in every country on Earth except North Korea, and spearheaded the fight against the Keystone Pipeline and started this huge fossil fuel divestment campaign, which now has about $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have sold off their coal or oil or gas stocks. That's all been good, but now, as you say, I'm also working with people my age, people over the age of 60. Young people have been providing most of the leadership here and doing a good job, but it's not okay to just demand that they do this by themselves. That's both ignoble and impractical, because for all their energy and idealism and intelligence, they lack the structural power to make those changes. people like me over the age of 60, there are 70 million of us in America, a population bigger than France. We punch above our weight politically. There's no known way to stop old people from voting,
Mm.
And we ended up with most of the money. Fair or not, the boomers and the silent generation have about 70% of the country's financial assets, compared with about 5% for millennials. So if you want to move Washington or you want to move Wall Street, then you're going to need people with hairlines like mine. And that's what we've been organizing at Third Act, and it's going very, very well, thank you. Um, Tens of thousands of people signing up in these first months. People had speculated that it would be difficult because the conventional wisdom is people become more conservative as they age. But this particular group of old people is interesting. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now,
Which I am, as you could
there
tell.
you go. Back in
Yeah.
your first act,
Yep.
back when we were young, we were around for the era of epic social and cultural and political transformation. The apex of the civil rights movement, the period when we started taking women seriously in public life, the moment when people were positing solutions other than war to our problems, the first Earth Day, and with it the creation of effective environmental regulation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the EPA. All these kind of things came from those years. In fact, you can tell because everything the Supreme Court is targeting now in its new right-wing reactionary phase all happened then. The Voting Rights Act of 65, the Gun Control Act of 68, the Clean Air Act of 71, Roe v. Wade in 73. These were the things that our generations fought for. And our slogan is, we won this fight once, we can win it again. Now, in our second act, I think that for the most part, with noble exceptions, people did focus more on consumerism than they did on citizenship. And that's one of the reasons we ended up in some of the fixes that we're in. But that's water under the bridge. We emerge now into our third act with lots of resources, the skills acquired over a lifetime, and with kids and grandkids who take this abstract concept of legacy and make it something very concrete. Your legacy is the world you leave behind for the people you love the most. And we're in the process of leaving behind a world that's much worse than the one we found, which is new for human beings and not, I think, at all what we want our legacy to be.
Well, you're very gracious, and with your, analysis of that generation, I like to think that I never left the first act. But in any case, as I said in the opening, the same issues exist with greater complexity today. And I like the way in which you've framed the third act as an interlocking attempt to deal with the plagues of climate, right-wing authoritarianism, and inequality. And I think it's very, very important to make these connections. The other thing I would like to throw at you, because I know you've mentioned in a lot of your writings, you're a lifelong Methodist, and in some of your writings, you've tackled issues, the environment in the book of Job, and at times of your life, you, as you mentioned, have taken solace in the Gospels of Matthew and so on. And I would like to just read a rather brief excerpt from Andrew Carnegie's work on wealth, the gospel of wealth. And I wonder, is this part of also the resistance that we're facing, the cultural, the spiritual, the rationalizations for a culture of greed? And here's Andrew Carnegie, of course, as you know, one of our infamous philanthropists, industrialists, robber barons, writing in 1889. The problem of our age is the proper administration of wealth, so that the ties of brotherhood may still bind the rich and poor in harmonious relationship. This is the problem of rich and poor to be solved. The laws of accumulation will be left free. The laws of distribution free. Individualism will continue, but the millionaire, get this, will be but a trustee for the poor, entrusted for a season with a part of the increased wealth of the community, but administering it for the community far better than it could or would have done for itself. Such is my opinion. It's the true gospel concerning wealth, obedience to which is destined someday to solve the problem of the rich and the poor and to bring, quote unquote, peace on earth among men, goodwill. So, how do you respond to that statement that justifies, rationalizes accumulation of endless growth, perhaps Protestant work ethic? People should work and be productive and consume to find out if they're one of the saved. How do you tie that into some of the work that you've been involved in?
Well, I guess I don't. That's
Okay.
I mean that's just not. I mean that's not a theology that I share particularly.
Oh
But
no,
in
of course I understand that. But
in
isn't that part of
Carnegie,
the theology we're facing?
well,
So much
first
in
of
this.
all, I'd say in Carnegie's defense, it's worth remembering that he lived in a very different world, uh,
Okay.
one that hadn't yet run into the physical limits that we're now describing. A world with a
Okay.
much smaller population, a world with much smaller economy, a world where we were not controlling the temperature of the planet, and so on and so forth. Um, um, but I think that the main problem um, theologically that we face is less a kind of Protestant work ethic than the hyper individualism that's come with the transition to very evangelical Christianity. It coincided with the Reagan Revolution and did the same thing politically, religiously, that was going on politically. We went from a world where the post war project of the US had been building what LBJ called the Great Society, what Dr. King called the beloved community, and replaced it with a world where the political project was a kind of hyper individual, market solve all problems, every man for himself sort of polity. And the same thing kind of happened in our religious life as we made the titanic shift from sort of the mainline Protestantism that had dominated American life to an evangelicalism that was very focused on a one-to-one, almost transactional relationship with deity, focused on individual salvation, um, and and so I think those things went hand in hand, and I think they describe our predicament pretty powerfully.
Right. Right. So, in your own personal upbringing, in your most recent book, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon, even though, as you mentioned in the book, you really only had sedans, right? But I guess that didn't sound as good for the title. Anyway, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. Tell us how we got into this. You're talking about a post World War II suburban boyhood, and fill us in a little bit on some of your own personal growth and realizations as you grew up in this world.
Well, I grew up in a very standard um, American suburban world, and that's at least in the 1970s when I was growing up was the American standard. It's where most Americans lived, where most growth was coming, where the American dream was defined. So I grew up, with my brother and my two parents and my father commuting to work, and we lived in a little house on a street literally called Middle Street, and this was in the town of Lexington, Massachusetts, which is arguably as American a town as there is because it's the place where the American Revolution began. My summer job was giving tours of the battle green, wearing my tricorn hat. So I identified very much with the America that I was growing up in. And I thought that it was a place that was getting steadily better. As I say, this was the era of Earth Day and hence the beginning of things like the Clean Air Act. It was a time when we were becoming more inclusive of more kinds of people in our democracy. Um, by decade's end, that had shifted, and we would elected Ronald Reagan, and we'd started demanding tax cuts and so on and so forth. I think that the project of working together to build a better society had been fatally undercut. Um, and so um, the question is why, and I think that suburbia had a lot to do with it. As people, uh, wealth began to rise with the fast rise in property values. Um, um, you know, it became um, people became more and more conservative, more and more grabby, more and more
Mm-hmm.
selfish, and that selfishness really was the subtext of things like Reaganism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned your own house, right? Your parents bought your house for 30,000, and it's worth over $1 million. You
Yes, they
sold.
bought it for $30,000 in 1970, which would be about $200,000 in today's money. And when it sold most recently, you're right, it went for $1 million. So that $800,000 increase in value was just the product of being in the right place at the right time. And
Right,
of course, it wasn't possible for everybody to be in the right place at the right time. Whole classes of Americans, mostly because of race
right.
and its effects on wealth, were excluded from that experience. And in fact, the racial wealth gap has widened over those 50 years, in large part because of that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you touched on that because again, how is that the climate struggle connected to issues of poverty and race? Because the argument is made that the poor are not concerned. I think that's a fallacy, but the argument is still made. Well, what they're looking for is jobs or the opportunity to move in to the system. And you've mentioned in your writing about the need to have another model. You refer to it as the Nordic model for America, and that's preferable than to simply deregulate capitalism as we know it here. So, how is the climate uh, struggle movement um, tied into the issues of structural racism and structural poverty?
Oh, well, I mean, look, the, the iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit by it. And, that's true in our country and it's true around the world. The entire African continent's put 2% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but it gets more climate damage than any other part of the world. In our own country, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to live next to a refinery and get asthma, or to live in a low-lying area and get flooded out, or to live in a trailer home that gets overwhelmed by the next storm, or on and on and on.
So, what is to be done? What are some of the uh, practical policies that you're trying to promote in the third act? Or what you work locally, but also think electorally, right? In the larger sense. How do you influence that electoral system to come up
Well,
with?
that's one, of course, one of the things that we're doing at places like Third Act is working hard on democracy, um, and um, and that'll be, that's a powerful tool, and you begin to see it in operation. So, this past month, the U.S. Congress finally acted on climate change, passing this Inflation Reduction Act. Not perfect, but useful. And it happened because of extraordinary pressure from activists over many years. Most recently, the Sunrise Movement, who were people that, who many of whom came out of this fossil fuel divestment movement. So over time, it's been uh, uh, building and building and building and building. And now we've reached a point where we can match the power of the fossil fuel industry and begin to force some change. Obviously, since we need to go fast, we'll do more. We need to do more and more. That IRA legislation is not perfect, but it's the first time that the Congress has acted in a very long time, and it's a good sign. It puts a lot of federal money at work on the project of helping this conversion, and it's entirely the product of activists. The young people from the Sunrise Movement who brought us the Green New Deal really got the ball rolling, and they actually came out, many of them, out of this divestment work that we've been doing all these years. So that's what happens when movements build for a long time. They begin to change the balance, and now activists are approaching the power of the fossil fuel industry, and so we're able to get at least some things done.
I was going to ask you too, what is your connection to some of the other environmental groups, such as Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion? So many of them came out of your own efforts, would you say? Or
Oh, not out of my efforts, but everybody works together. It's just a big, broad movement. It's powerful.
okay, all right. Are you connected also with Reverend William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign?
Definitely support all the work that he's doing, and I find extraordinary inspiration in watching it.
Same here. Yeah, we've had him on the show. Absolutely. So tell us where we're at. I know that you do seem to have hope for this new climate initiative, correct? How far away from the sort of goals you're talking about are we at this present moment?
Well, we're a very long ways away. A world away. But hopefully, if we get started down the right path, that transition will accelerate. I mean, the good news is that the things we need to do make extraordinary sense. If we need to transition to electric vehicles, they're better than the ones that we're replacing. Solar energy and wind energy are better than coal and gas and oil, not just because they don't wreck the climate, but also because they don't create the particulate pollution that kills 9 million humans a year, the second or third leading cause of death on Earth, and because they don't provide funding for fascists like Vladimir Putin as he tries to wage war on decent people in Ukraine. Nobody's going to be able to blockade the sun or the wind and use it as a weapon of war the way that Putin uses hydrocarbons. So there's lots of reasons to hope that if we get going, we might go quickly. But we've got to get going.
Right. I have a friend here in East End of Long Island who gave me a couple of questions for you, and I hope you be able to answer them for her. She's been involved in various community organizing out here with local farmers and fishermen and so on. And here are two questions. What are the short-term and long-term effects to the water table from the usage of glyphosites on all of the farms? I hope I pronounced that right. GLY phosphates on all the farms.
Well, glyphosates are a class of pesticides and herbicides. They're used, it's Monsanto's Roundup, I think, is the trade name that's most widely used. And we're beginning to understand that they have a number of potentially difficult side effects. That whole class, the whole world of pesticides, especially things like the neonicotinoids, are really now causing extraordinary trouble. And between them and climate change and habitat loss and other factors, we're moving quickly into a major extinction event on this planet.
Mm-hmm. The other question she wanted to raise here is, how will rising sea levels affect the communities, particularly in Long Island, the South Fork here, East End? And is desalination plants a possible solution to help mitigate both the rising sea levels and the record droughts?
Well, possible, but desalination is very expensive in energy terms and economic terms. So you wouldn't want to rely on it if you didn't have to. The places that use it tend to be places with no choices, parts of the Middle East, for instance. Long Island, like any other low-lying area, will be affected by rising sea levels. At a certain point, they'll, start to swamp beaches and things. But for the moment, the real danger is that when big storms come, as they occasionally do to that part of the world, uh, they'll be riding in on a higher ocean and hence pushing that ocean further inland as it comes.
Right. Which administration has been most open to your climate changes? I know you talked a lot about the Carter administration. So what happened there? Why was there such resistance to his efforts and to some of the
Well, of course, Jimmy Carter was sort of before we even knew about climate change, but
right?
Uh, he did want to transition us to solar energy. He wanted America to be producing 20% of its power from solar energy by the year 2000. And if he, that was the plan he was pushing when he was defeated by Reagan in the 1980 election. And Reagan was a product of the fossil fuel industry. He climbed up on the roof of the White House and took down the solar panels that Jimmy Carter had put up, ended all the research on renewable energy, flushed the beginnings of that industry down the toilet. And so we wasted decades, and we continue to waste time because the same reason. The fossil fuel industry is politically powerful and often gets its way.
But the new climate bill has opened up the possibility of tax breaks, right, and subsidies.
Exactly right. There's a lot of money that will now be going in the direction of renewable energy, and it should provide a big boost to that industry. And the good news is that it's on a steep learning curve. So every time we double the amount of installed solar capacity, the price goes down another 30%. That's really interesting. That's, there's not many things on a curve like that.
Right. I did ask you before, could you explain what you mean by the Nordic model, how that might be applied to America?
Well, my friend Bernie Sanders always talks about looking towards some of the Nordic countries as an example for how you might do capitalism in a way that doesn't really resemble ours at all. I mean, they still have capitalism. You hand someone money and he or she hands you something back. There are stores and stock markets and things, but companies are not given laissez-faire. They're not treated like people. They're not allowed to do things that are contrary to the public interest.
You also mentioned rapid innovation can cause harm to humanity. What did you mean by that? And how is that tied into your interest in libertarianism?
I'm sorry, what can cause harm to humanity?
Well, as you mentioned, rapid, looking for the exact quote here, the shortcomings of the growth economy and
growth
rapid
at this
innovation
point
may come to hurt humanity, rapid innovations.
Yeah, no, growth at this point is, in many cases quite dysfunctional. All the growth wealth ends up in the hands of a few people. Meanwhile, the costs of that growth, including the damage to the climate and things, are socialized, as it were. So the good news is, I think, that the next round of growth, if there is any, is probably going to be involved in this transition off fossil energy and onto renewable energy. And that sets us up for a much more localized and locally controlled economy and energy system, which I think will be useful in many ways.
So growth in itself is not bad. It's just how we use it.
I don't know. I truthfully, I think we're probably at a point where in the developed world, we've grown large enough. And I've written a great deal about this. There's a book of mine called Deep Economy that tackles it very directly. But right now, the important thing is this transition.
Also back, I guess in the 70s, there was talk about population, limits to world population. That doesn't seem to be a conversation anymore. Is that part of what we need to be also considering for climate justice?
Say again, population growth?
Population growth, yeah. It was an issue that we talked more about back in the 70s.
Yeah, I think the reason we talked more about it is that in the meantime, we've done something about it. The rate of human fertility has dropped like a rock. The average woman had 6 children then on this planet. That number is now approaching 2. So the change has been enormous. And it's really the result of people in the developing world figuring out that when you educated and empowered women to any extent, it turned out most of them didn't want to have 6 kids. And so that's been a very good and useful change. And as a result, the entire human population will begin to drop sometime in the course of this century. That'll take some of the pressure off.
Right. You've also mentioned research that people are responding to the pessimism, the cynicism of our time, as they see it, by wondering whether they should have children at all. So there's a tremendous reluctance to consider that. Is that true as well?
Yes, the survey data shows that young people are increasingly worried about whether or not they should have kids because of the climate crisis. And that's a very sad position to be in, I think. I understand their fears, but I hope that people are able to overcome them. And I hope it's because we start building a world that's not as scary.
Right. Have you had issue? Well, let me put it this way. Intergenerational rivalries, are we living in such different worlds? Are the young people connecting to the messages that we've been talking about here in terms of what went on in the 60s and 70s?
Young people are way ahead of older people at the moment. In the environmental movement, in the new civil rights movement, and elsewhere, young people are providing extraordinary leadership. And the job of the rest of us is to figure out how to back them up. And that's what we're doing at Third Act for sure.
So what is the 2 or 3 most important things that the elders might be able to contribute as helpers for young people?
Sure. Older people, because we have a lot of the country's financial resources, are able uniquely to put pressure on big banks, say. Our campaign at Third Act focuses on Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, the 4 biggest banks in the country, and also the 4 biggest lenders to the fossil fuel industry. And we're getting people by the tens of thousands to pledge that they will cut up their credit cards if these banks don't begin to shift their practices, for instance. And then going on to pressure state treasurers and controllers and things to reevaluate their relationships unless these banks get their act together. So that's a good example of how older people can back up the calls of younger people for work.
And through civil disobedience, getting arrested too, right?
Yes, I think it's particularly appropriate for older people to be engaged in civil disobedience. If you're a young person, if you're 19, it's possible that an arrest record's not the best thing for your resume. But, you know, one of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you?
What else are they going to do to you? Right,
exactly. Right.
Exactly. You know, in a few minutes we have left, I wonder if you could touch on, because I live in the city as well, New York City. Speak a little about climate change and the climate movement as it might affect a place like New York City.
New York City.
What are the sort of policies that are needed to make it more livable?
New York's has been at the forefront of this work. New York's been a great example. Its comptroller, first Scott Stringer, now Brad Lander, have been important parts of this divestment campaign. Its city council has now adopted important legislation that will require the electrification of buildings, new buildings, and the retrofitting of older buildings to reduce their carbon emissions. So New York is really taking a leadership role, which makes sense because New York is, of course, in big trouble. Rising sea level is bad news. If you go stand on the seawall at the Battery, you're only a few feet above the Atlantic Ocean.
Right. Well, and there's only talk of putting up a seawall right there. It's not going to be around Manhattan, right? So
I think that the current plan is for what they're calling a U barrier, and it'll be sort of lower Midtown will be the kind of extent
is what they.
And that's because it's extremely expensive to try to do this, protect people that way. Much less expensive to try and prevent it from rising in the first place.
There was talk of what do you think about the possibilities of a progressive leadership taking over the presidency? Isn't that all this is fine and dandy, and it's absolutely essential, but don't we need leadership at the very top as well to come up with the big programs or fund or channel the funding that is so needed at a local level?
Sure. I mean, at the moment, I think we're seeing some of that. Um, you know, because Bernie did so well in the presidential primaries in 2016 and then 2020, more centrist leaders like Joe Biden had no choice but to adopt many of his policies.
Yeah.
And it's really sort of Bernie's policies more than Biden's that are reflected in this Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, and all the government spending that it entails.
That's a great point. What happened with Bill Clinton during that administration? You were also involved in that struggle with certain policies with him. How receptive was he in particular?
Well, of course, Al Gore, as vice president, knew a lot about climate change, but they didn't manage to get very much done, it must be said. And the power of the fossil fuel industry was enough to prevent the adoption in the U.S. of the Kyoto protocols and things. So very little happened in that era.
So when we do get so-called moderate or centrist leadership, we're not talking about a Reagan or a Trump. It seems like the moderate centrist Democrats are pretty enfeebled in their ability to stand up to those interests. I mean, as you point out, it's the progressives and the pressure that progressives are putting on the young kids and the movement, the demonstrations and so on, that's really impacting whatever administration, what is being done in the administrations. Would that be fair?
Yes, that's right. That's correct. I think that's an astute political analysis. People are doing what they can, and
Right.
we're making progress. Would we be making more progress if we had 65 Bernie Sanders in the Senate? Yes, of course, but that we don't. So we do as best we can, and that's just reality.
Got it. I again, in a couple of minutes we still have. You've talked a lot about electoral politics and non-civil disobedience and so on. What's your take on the census strategy of Cloward and Piven, creating disruption? That's really where we push the envelope during these brief moments that we might have to push for change.
Yes, I think that nonviolent movement building is the most important key at the bottom of all of this. And I think that's the work that we've done at places like 350.org or Third Act is very much about creating disruptions that the political system then has to absorb and synthesize and make use of. So I think that kind of organizing is the key kind of organizing, and it's why I've ended up in jail a lot.
Well, I hope to join you there at some point. I'm all for what you're doing, and I'm at that point where they can't do that much to me either. So, but
There you go.
There we go. But tell us, in the moment that we have left, how we reach you, how people can sign up for the Third Act.
As long as you're over the age of 60.
First Act,
as long as you're over the age of 60 or even getting near, just go to thirdact.org and join in. And we're forming chapters all over the place, and the work is a lot of fun.
Terrific. All right. Well, we'll do. Hey, this is a lot of fun too. Thank you so much.
It is. Many thanks, Jim. You have a good day.
Thanks. Many blessings. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you again soon.
All right. God bless.
God bless. Thank you. And thank you so very, very much for watching us on the Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again on the Radical Imagination.